most, if not all of you, have been doing assessments for many, many years. So what we're doing, we want to emphasize the aspect of transformational care planning and the integration of strengths into our assessment. Right now, we've got this little line item in assessment, and it's like, okay, what are your strengths? And you write friendly, resilient, compliant with medication, not compliant with medication, whatever it may be. So what we're going to kind of pull in here is that aspect of how do we integrate the cultural aspects that someone has gone through in their life, their experiences, the what, the data collection, extrapolating the meaning behind all of this into someone's life. We're going to look at medical necessity because that's always the question that everyone likes to kind of trickle in. And as Steve mentioned earlier, everything that we're going over today, it is medically, it does fall in with medical necessity. So if you have questions or concerns about that, don't feel afraid to ask. We're ready for those things. And we're going to look at the different domains and strengths throughout the assessment. There will be pieces that we're saying, okay, this is your assessment, but how do we integrate TCP throughout all of those domains? So as we indicated before, TCP is a collaborative process. So when we're doing the assessment, it's not just collecting data from previous providers or sitting there and reading off the questions saying, okay, what are the identifying factors? What did you come here for? It's really getting an understanding of how this person has gone through their life and what are the details that kind of contributes to them being here right now. And the more information you can collect, the more you can kind of extrapolate from that, the better off you are when you're getting into your narrative and your treatment plan, because there's going to be this theme of a golden thread that kind of weaves through everything so that each document isn't separate from each other. We're going to look at as a buildup. Often, Steve and I are going to talk about kind of the initial intake process, but all of this can flow through as we do our annual assessments and really reevaluating where the person is in treatment. And we're looking at the focus of the goals that the client and their family have. And once again, we're looking at family as natural supports, blood relatives, whatever it is that that individual identifies as meaningful in their life. So right now, we're going to talk about narratives coming up, and that's the story of the person. The assessment is the data collection that's going to contribute to that story. So it's kind of like sticky notes. You know how you're at your desk and you have to remember something really quick. You write it on a little sticky note and you stick it there and you look at it and you're like, what in the world does that mean? That's what the assessment is. The assessment is a collection of a bunch of sticky notes that you're looking at saying, what in the world does this mean? And then we're going to be looking at that ongoing process. We don't just assess one time and move on. Continually through our services, we're always checking in to see where is this person in their treatment? How are they doing? Are we seeing any developmental changes? Are we seeing any movement through the stages of change? And we're looking for themes throughout this process too. One of my staff yesterday was teasing me because I was talking about this training, and in all of my team meetings, we go over TCP plans. We're constantly supervising to it. And she goes, you're always asking about themes. What's going on with the theme? What's going on with the theme? That's a lot of what TCP is what are the themes that we're seeing throughout this person's life? And the assessment really helps us identify these things by the questions that we're asking. The skill building acquisition that we have, we're also looking to build skills in someone else's life. So as I noted, these are kind of our assessment areas that we're always looking at in our salmon form, the notorious salmon form. But as we're working with an individual, we're also utilizing these areas. One area that I like to point out in particular is right here, the stages of change. How many people in this room are familiar with trans-theoretical model or the stages of change? Okay, good. We've got about half the room. This is something that I really encourage everyone to become familiar with, because not only is it something that pairs to evidence-based practices, but it also gives us some movement. We're looking for what can we see in someone. So if someone's pre-contemplative about their illness at this time, meaning that they feel that there's nothing wrong going on, they're perfectly fine, even though what we're seeing is something totally different. Historically, that's been called denial. Not a great word. Don't recommend it. But pre-contemplative kind of gives that phase of this is where someone is in their recovery. And now we're starting to see movement in their skill acquisition, in their behaviors, in their mindset of their treatment, the stages of change really kind of paint that picture. So I encourage you guys to get familiar with that because it is something that we're integrating throughout TCP and it will fold into the narrative. Other areas that we want to look at are when we're looking at the presenting problem, what is it that brought them to this place? What are the things that got them to the point in their life that they are today? This goes back to the resiliency factors that Steve was talking about earlier. We're also looking heavily at medical status and needs. How are those things impacting this person? So we're gathering all of this information to make sense out of it later. Once again, we talk about resiliency, we talk about strengths. We want to get more functional in strengths. So when we're talking about things that are functional, if someone is friendly, what does that mean? Can I get a raise of hands of anyone who can define what friendly would be? Approachable.
Easily sociable.
Easily sociable. We're getting more into it. What else? Open. Okay, how are those functional though?
Because they increase your connection with people.
There we go. So when we're talking about strengths inclusion, we want to get to that point of saying, okay, this person's friendly, but how is that a strength in their life? Because they could be friendly, but it could be a little too friendly because maybe they're going up to people all the time. So we want to say something to the point, to the effect of that they're able to really engage with others and know when to step back as well. So it's really broadening those one-word descriptors, but also figuring out how to include that in their treatment. When we're looking at functional strengths, we can list 20 or 30 down, but are those really strengths that are going to be benefiting them in their treatment in the future? So we want to really pay attention to those things. We also want to look at the developmental assets, not just of the individual, but also the supports around their life. If they're in a dysfunctional family system where everyone's involved in 20 different things and there's no family support really around, how is that impacting their life? How is that impacting their development or the family structure development as a whole as well? I was working with some staff on a plan and we went back to their assessment. And this is an individual who had been in the system for about 30, 40 years. So starting in his youth all the way through his adulthood. And the case manager knew him for years, but really didn't know him. So the assessment didn't give a whole lot of information on that. As we went through it, we ended up finding out that this particular individual was developmentally stunted. He acted like a 15-year-old. He was into skateboarding, which is great, but he wasn't utilizing it as a strength further. She would put, he's really into skateboarding, but what does that do? And as it turned out, there was a family issue because the family was enabling a lot of the behavior. They were paying for things, keeping him out of jail. He wasn't experiencing things the way that would have moved his development forward into adulthood. So that was an area that we were able to find as a theme for later on working with him. And that helped refine the assessment process as well, because now she could ask better questions to get a better understanding of where he had come from. Once again, we've got this golden thread of cultural inclusion, that cultural humility that we're talking about. So when we're looking at this, we want to know, how do these things impact someone's life, the environment that they're in? If someone has been living in poverty for all, majority of their life, and now they're in a home, say in Los Gatos, because maybe that's where their new board and care is, that's a huge shift for them. Or if they never had support through their life and now they're in an FSP-like program where they're constantly getting support, that's a cultural shift as well. So we're looking beyond race, beyond ethnicity, and looking at all the smaller factors within their life. They call it co-culture. You've got your drug culture, your homeless culture, foster care system is also culture. So looking at the environmental impacts in someone's life and how that's really impacting the move through, digging down deeper. We'll talk about this in a slide or two, but how many people are familiar with the DSM's cultural assessment section? I think it's Appendix I. How many people use that? One person? One? While it is a very technical piece, it is something you may want to look at because it can give you a little bit more insight and questions to ask people to get a better understanding. As Steve had talked about earlier, we're talking about cultural humility. I always give the example as I present as Caucasian, and I am Portuguese, which is often seen as Caucasian. I don't identify as Caucasian. And I actually take offense to it when people call me that. And so when I've seen staff that have just put people into a box like that, I actually challenge that. It's that whole engaged in American culture, Caucasian, and it puts it in a box. And so I challenge them to really go in and understand what is that impact for someone. We actually had a client who was Portuguese, living in an area that was predominantly Vietnamese speaking. And they said there were no cultural factors in the assessment. The first thing I want to say is I encourage everyone to take off the yes or no checkbox, because to me, and I know Steve and I have had this discussion, there's always a cultural factor in treatment across the board, and I will challenge anyone who tries to say there is not. But on top of that, that aspect of, I asked her, I said, this is a person who does not speak the language of her neighbors. Is she willing to leave her home? How does she shop? How does she get around? And the case manager started to think, and she's like, well, she isolates. And I said, why does she isolate? Well, she has no friends. What's that about? As we've started discussing it more, it was, instead of just taking down the first thing that came to mind, that little data piece, we understood a little bit more and were able to expand on the assessment, so it was a much more rich document for them. And then she shared that with the individual as well, further down the line with the narrative. So it's really showing that acceptance and getting a better understanding of where someone is in their culture as well. And I encourage you guys to do that, is don't just take the surface of what someone says. Don't just say, what is your culture? Get creative, or when you're coaching someone, really work that in. Ask questions that clarify for you so that you have a better understanding of who that person is. So again, we want to talk about the accountability of the assessment. The assessment is our core piece to medical necessity. This is where we're establishing where are the dysfunctional areas in this person's life that we can overcome in a strength-based way. So if we're looking at the reimbursable pieces, what are the things that we want to incorporate? I open that up to you guys.
To ensure that the assessment is cohesive with the treatment plan and the diagnosis at the end, it needs to reflect overall the diagnosis.
Yeah.
Especially number 2, presenting problems.
Mm-hmm. So did everyone hear that? The key word there was cohesive. Making sure that through the assessment, everything is still relating to each other so that it strengthens the medical necessity. So if we're starting off listing all kinds of symptoms, are we also putting in there the functional impairments that are going on? Are we also putting in there the cultural factors that are tying in? And how do these pieces link to give a picture of this individual? And that's what we're going to keep emphasizing, so that we're not just looking at the constant change of people and that everyone becomes one. Every single person is an individual, so their assessment should stand on its own and be a cohesive unit that links the diagnosis, the symptoms, the behaviors, the functions. And then, of course, we've got the diagnosis at the end that kind of seals that in a little bit more. We already know all of this piece. So we want to emphasize the need to broaden the assessment and really make it a tool that you guys can use that is functional throughout treatment. And that if there are changes that you have to make because maybe you've learned something more about that individual or their family, that you're incorporating that into treatment, because this is that tool that you're going to draw from. The other piece that I like to tell people is, what if you went on vacation? Or what if you weren't there? What if you changed agencies? What if you moved out of the area? Someone is taking that chart. Or if you're coming in, you want to make sure that that chart that you're getting gives you enough information to kind of go towards the person and say, this is what I understand of your situation. So giving that appreciation to others by writing a really cohesive and thorough assessment is what I would encourage everyone to do. Any question on the tie-in for TCP in that? So the main theme through this is cultural inclusiveness and strengths inclusion throughout the whole of the assessment. So once again, we're looking at, it's the initial step, it's the engaging piece, it's what keeps things going throughout. We're getting those sticky notes and posting it up on our wall. And we're also getting everyone involved in the process. This is not just us taking the information and writing it down. We're asking questions for clarity, we're putting those sticky notes down, and then we're also involving family members or supports to really build on things.